Wind combs the tall grass of the Coyote Springs Prairie in long, whispering strokes that sound like distant voices calling names no one remembers. The midday sun hangs white and merciless over the flat expanse, baking the earth until it cracks in patterns that resemble old scars, fractures that run deep and never quite heal. Heat shimmers rise from the ground, in waves distorting the horizon, until it seems the world might dissolve into nothing but light and dust and the endless indifferent sky. A Lakota warrior named Chaska moves through the grass with the kind of silence that comes not from caution alone, but from a lifetime of reading the land as other men read printed words. He wears buckskin darkened by sweat, and whether the leather soft and supple from years of use, the fringe along his sleeves, torn in places where thorns and barbed wire have caught and pulled. His soft-soled moccasins leave prints so faint they might be shadows, and his hair black as crow feathers and hanging loose past his shoulders is held back only by a strip of red cloth knotted at his brow, a color his grandmother once told him would keep the spirits of the prairie from mistaking him for prey. He carries no rifle, just a short knife sheathed at his hip in worn rawhide, and a leather pouch slung across his chest containing pemmican, a coil of sinew, and a small bundle wrapped in deerskin that he will not speak of to anyone. Beside him walks a woman in a torn dress, the fabric once a serviceable blue, but now faded to the color of old bruises, the hem ragged and dust-caked. Her name is Lena Juliana Capel, and she keeps one hand on the collar of a lean sighthound that pants softly in the heat, its ribs showing beneath dappled fur, its eyes sharp and fixed on something ahead that only it can see. The dog belonged to kind Kate back in town, a widowed laundress who used it to chase jackrabbits for her stew pot. But Kate had lent it freely when Lena explained what she needed. Lena's other hand rises slowly now, pointing toward a break in the grass where iron shapes emerge like bones from shallow graves, half hidden by sage and creeping vines that seem determined to swallow them whole. "There," she says, her voice hoarse from thirst and fear and the dust that coats her throat like ash. Chaska follows her gesture with his eyes narrowing them against the glare. Vines and sage choke the remnants of a locomotive tipped on its side, its boilers split open like a gutted animal, the metal edges jagged and rust-eaten. The carriages behind it lie smashed and scattered, their wooden panels splintered, their wheels half buried in soil that has begun to reclaim them with patient inevitability. Rust coats every surface in flaking layers of orange and brown. And the whole scene looks like something from a nightmare or from a past that men would prefer to forget. It appears abandoned, forgotten, a relic of some disaster that happened long ago and was left to rot under the sun. But Chaska knows better than to trust appearances. He has learned through loss and hardship that the most dangerous things in this territory are often the ones that look dead, but are merely sleeping. He kneels beside the nearest rail, running his fingers along the iron with the careful attention of a man reading scripture. The metal is warm not from the sun alone, but from something else. Near the base of a rotting tie, he finds fresh tar black and sticky applied recently to patch a crack. He touches it, and the substance clings to his fingertips, still tacky. "Tracks were used last week," he says quietly, his voice carrying no more volume than necessary. "Maybe less?" Lena's breath catches in her throat, the sound small and sharp. The dog whines low and uncertain and pulls against her grip, its nose twitching as if it smells something it does not like. Chaska rises slowly and moves toward the nearest carriage, his steps careful, his eyes scanning the ground for prints. He finds them quickly, boot marks circling the wreck in patterns that speak of recent activity of men who walked with purpose and urgency. Some of the prints are deep, made by heavy boots with heel irons. Others are lighter, limping, dragging slightly, as if the person wearing them had been injured or exhausted. He reaches the buckled door of a passenger coach and braces his shoulder against it, pushing until the hinges shriek in protest and finally give way, with a metallic groan that echoes across the empty prairie. The door swings inward and a smell rushes out. Rust and old wood and something else, something sour and metallic that makes the back of his throat tighten and his stomach turn. Inside, the air is thick and stifling. Iron shackles hang from bolts driven into the walls, their chains rusted but intact, long enough to allow a person to sit, but not to stand or move more than a few feet. Gag cloths lie crumpled in corners, stained dark with substances Chaska does not want to identify. The floor is marked with stains that might be blood or might be oil. It is impossible to tell in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the splintered walls. In the baggage car beyond canvas sacks, stamped with the words U.S. Mail, in bold black letters lie torn open, their contents spilled across the floor, letters, packages, small parcels that were never delivered to their intended recipients. A ledger bound in pigskin rests on a tilted shelf, its pages filled with careful, meticulous handwriting. But the writing is strange columns of letters and numbers that seem to form patterns but make no immediate sense. Some entries are clear enough dates, initials, amounts of money, but others are coded using symbols that might be shorthand or might be cipher. Chaska picks it up, frowning at the cryptic notations, his fingers tracing the strange marks, as if touch might reveal what sight cannot. Lena steps inside her free hand, pressed to her mouth as if to hold back a sound she does not want to make. She looks around at the shackles, the gags, the stains, and her eyes grow wide with horror and disbelief. The reality of what this place was, what it still is, settles over her like a shroud. "What is this place?" she whispers, though part of her already knows the answer will be worse than any nightmare she has imagined. Chaska does not answer immediately. He steps deeper into the wreck, his moccasins silent on the warped floorboards. And then he sees it, the thing that stops them both cold, and makes the world seem to narrow to a single terrible point of focus. Beneath a bench in the corner, someone has nailed crib bars to form a hidden cell no bigger than a coffin. The wood is new pale against the weathered planks around it, the nails still shiny and unrusted. Inside the makeshift cage lies a small, knitted booty sized for an infant's foot. It is not dusty. It is not faded by time or sun. It is fresh, the wool still soft, and when Chaska picks it up, he can feel warmth clinging to it, warmth that could only have come from a hand that held it minutes, perhaps seconds before they arrived. He holds the booty in his palm, feeling its weight, and for the first time since Lena met him, she sees something flicker in his dark eyes. Something that might be rage, or might be grief, or might be both tangled together so tightly they cannot be separated. His jaw tightens, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, and his breathing changes, becoming slower, more deliberate, as if he is fighting to keep something caged inside himself. "Someone was here," he says quietly, his voice low and rough, each word carefully controlled. "Just now. They left in a hurry." Lena's throat tightens, and she feels a coldness spreading through her chest, despite the heat of the day. The implications crash over her in waves. Children, prisoners, people moved like cargo through this hidden network, their suffering documented in coded ledgers and measured in booty-sized cells. "Who would do this?" she asks, though part of her already knows the answer will not be one she wants to hear. Boot prints circle the wreck in fresh patterns, and Chaska follows them with his eyes tracing their path to the ridgeline beyond the train. There, glinting in the sun like a predator's eye, he sees it, a scoped rifle fitted with a Malcolm telescopic sight, the barrel pointed directly at them. His body recognizes the danger before his mind can fully process it, instinct screaming a warning that comes half a heartbeat too late. The first shot comes before he can shout a warning, before he can even fully process what he is seeing. The round strikes the locomotive's shell with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil, a sharp metallic crack that makes the whole wreck shudder. Rust flakes explode into the air, swirling like burning embers, and the report echoes across the prairie with the finality of a death sentence. Chaska moves on pure instinct, No thought involved, just the body's knowledge of danger, honed by years of survival. He lunges forward and grabs Lena by the shoulders, pulling her down hard, covering her body with his own. The dog yelps and wedges itself between them, trembling from nose to tail, its breath coming in quick, panicked pants. 3 more shots follow in rapid succession, each one closer than the last, the shooter adjusting for wind and distance, with the precision of someone who has done this many times before. The bullets punch through thin metal and splintered wood with sounds like bones breaking, sending splinters raining down on them in a shower of debris. Dust fills the air, choking and blinding, and the smell of gunpowder mixes with rust and old blood. "Crawl." Chaska orders, his voice low and urgent against her ear, his breath warm on her skin, his weight pressing her into the floorboards. "Stay low. Move." They scramble forward on their stomachs, elbows and knees, dragging them across broken glass that cuts through fabric and into skin. Metal dust coats their mouths and throats, making every breath taste like blood and iron. Lena's breath comes in gasps, her heart hammering so hard she can feel it in her fingertips and her throat, in the pulse points at her temples. Fear floods her system sharp and chemical, making her hands shake and her vision tunnel. Chaska keeps his forearm braced over her head, shielding her from falling debris as bullets tear through the wreck around them with the relentless precision of a predator closing in on wounded prey. When they reach the far end of the carriage, they tumble out into the sage and keep crawling, dragging the ledger with them wrapped hastily in Lena's torn shawl, the fabric clutched in her fist like a lifeline. The shooting stops. Silence settles over the prairie, thick and heavy as smoke, broken only by the whisper of wind through grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The sudden absence of gunfire is almost worse than the shooting itself, and the quiet filled with terrible possibilities. The shooter repositioning, reloading, moving to flank them. Chaska waits, counting his own breaths, to keep his mind clear, listening for the crunch of boots on gravel, the metallic click of a rifle being cocked, any sound that might betray their hunter's position. Then he rises slowly and pulls Lena deeper into the brush, his forearm staying braced protectively over her, until they are well out of rifle range, hidden among rocks and sage, where the shadows are deep and cool. For a long moment, neither of them moves. Lena counts his breaths to quiet her own, slow, steady, deliberate, the rhythm of a man who has learned to control fear rather than be controlled by it. She can feel the tension in his muscles coiled and ready, can feel the heat of his body against hers in the confined space. Then Chaska shifts, lifting his weight carefully off her, and she realizes how close they have been pressed together, how she could feel the beat of his heart through his chest, how his body had formed a shield between her and death, without hesitation, without thought, for his own safety. The gravity of that gesture settles over her slowly. He could have run. He could have saved himself. Instead, he had covered her body with his own, accepting the possibility of a bullet in his back to give her a chance at survival. The weight of that choice, the sheer uncalculated selflessness of it, leaves her breathless in a way that has nothing to do with fear. Later, when they stop to catch their breath in the shelter of a dry wash, where the earth is cracked and pale, Lena notices movement near her foot, a coiled prairie rattler, sunning itself on a flat rock, its scales gleaming like polished bronze, its head raised and tongue flicking to taste the air. She freezes instantly, her heart hammering all over again, every muscle in her body locking tight with instinctive terror. The snake is close enough that she can see the patterns on its scales, can hear the faint rustle of its body against stone. Chaska sees it at the same moment. Without speaking, he rolls his sleeve over her calf to keep her from moving, and startling the snake, his touch firm and sure, then reaches for a forked stick lying nearby. He lowers it slowly, carefully pinning the rattler's head with practiced precision born of long experience, then ushers her past with a gesture. When they are clear, he releases the snake and steps back, letting it slither away into the rocks alive and unharmed. Lena realizes her hands are shaking too much to tie her boot, which has come loose during their crawl through the wreck. The laces dangle in the dust, and her fingers fumble uselessly at them, clumsy and uncooperative, still trembling with adrenaline and fear. She tries twice, fails both times, and feels a surge of frustration that threatens to become something worse, tears maybe, or hysterical laughter. Chaska kneels without a word, his movements calm and unhurried, and laces the boot tight, his fingers deft and sure, working with the kind of efficiency that speaks of competence earned through necessity. His eyes meet hers and hold steady, not challenging, not judging, just present. He does not speak, and neither does she. But something passes between them in that moment, something that feels like trust taking root in soil that has been barren for too long. An understanding that goes beyond words. I will not let you fall. 4 days earlier, Lena Juliana Kappel had stepped off a freight wagon in the dusty settlement of Coyote Springs with nothing but a canvas satchel that smelled of mildew, a worn pair of boots that pinched her toes, and a name written on a scrap of paper folded so many times the creases had begun to tear. The name was Henry Kappel. Her brother, her only family. The one person in the world who shared her blood and her memories of a childhood spent in crowded tenements where the air always smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke, where winter meant huddling around a stove that never quite produced enough heat, where summer meant sweltering nights with windows thrown open to catch any breath of wind. She had crossed half the territory with a wagon train, bound for the Oregon settlements, sewing torn canvas and mending harnesses in exchange for passage, sleeping under wagons when it rained and walking beside the oxen when the trail grew too steep for riding. The other travelers had been kind enough, though wary of a woman traveling alone, and she had kept mostly to herself, speaking only when spoken to, and never volunteering more information than necessary. When the train stopped to resupply at Coyote Springs, she had paid the driver $3 to let her off, ignoring his warnings about the rough territory and rougher men. Henry had written her a letter 6 months ago, the paper thin and cheap, the handwriting hurried but legible. He had said he found work on a rail spur near a silver mine called Mercury Falls, that the pay was steady and the prospects good, that he was saving money and would send for her once he got properly settled. He promised her a place to stay, a chance to start fresh a life, better than the one they had left behind in the cramped, filthy streets of New York. But the letters had stopped coming 3 months ago, and the silence had gnawed at her ever since, a quiet, persistent ache, like a tooth going bad, impossible to ignore, no matter how hard she tried. She had waited another month, hoping for word, then packed what little she owned and set out to find him. Coyote Springs was a collection of low buildings huddled against the prairie, like a wounded animal trying to stay small and unnoticed. The main street was dirt rutted by wagon wheels and hoofprints lined with a general store that sold flour and sugar at prices that made her wince, a blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil echoed through the day, a saloon with peeling paint, and a sign that read "The Silver Dollar" in letters half faded by sun and wind, and a boarding house with a hand-painted sign that said "Kind Kate's" in cheerful blue script that seemed almost defiant in its optimism. Lena rented a cot there for 50 cents a week, counting out the coins carefully from the small purse she kept tied inside her dress. Kate was a widowed laundress with gray streaks in her hair and hands red and raw from lye soap, the skin cracked in places that must have hurt, but which she never complained about. She was a woman who spoke her mind without apology, her voice carrying the rough edges of someone who had survived hardship and emerged with her dignity intact, battered but unbroken. She asked no questions when Lena arrived, which Lena appreciated more than she could say. And she kept the rooms clean and the linens fresh, which Lena respected deeply. "You look like you have been traveling hard," Kate said, sizing Lena up with a glance that missed nothing, and the dust on her dress, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she held herself like someone braced for disappointment. "There is water in the basin and soap if you want to wash. Supper is at 6 and I do not hold it for anyone, so be on time or go hungry." "Thank you," Lena said quietly, her voice rough from dust and disuse. Kate paused at the door, then added, her tone gentler, You are looking for someone. I can see it in your face, that particular kind of worry that comes from not knowing. Be careful who you ask about in this town. Some questions get you answers you do not want, and others get you into trouble you cannot get out of. The next morning, Lena walked to the telegraph shack at the edge of town, following directions from Kate. The wire went out at first light, and the U.S. Marshal's party did not ride in until late the following afternoon. No miracle sprint, just horses made warm by hard miles and relay stations changing mounts. It was a small building with a single window covered by an oilcloth curtain and a wire strung to a pole that leaned at such a dangerous angle it seemed a strong wind might topple it. Inside, a young man sat hunched over a brass telegraph key, tapping out messages with quick, nervous fingers that never seemed to stop moving. His name was Jeremiah Quinn, but everyone called him Quick Quinn on account of his stammer and the speed with which he worked to avoid having to speak aloud more than absolutely necessary. I am looking for my brother, Lena said, setting the scrap of paper on the counter between them, the ink faded but still legible. Henry Capel. He worked on the Mercury Falls spur. Quinn glanced at the paper, then at her face, then back at the key, as if the brass instrument might save him from having to answer. His fingers paused mid-tap, hovering over the key like birds uncertain where to land. He licked his lips, which were chapped and peeling, and leaned forward, lowering his voice to barely more than a whisper that she had to strain to hear. Mercury Falls spur ain't on no maps. He said the words coming in stuttering bursts that spoke of genuine fear. Run by the syndicate. B. Bison Bill Hart owns it, and his foreman is crooked teeth Tom, meaner than a snake and twice as likely to bite. There's also Sheriff P. Praxton. He is in their pocket deep as a man can go. Them miners say they haul ore silver mostly, but there is talk of other things. And a night freight that runs without manifests. Secret routes that don't go through the toll stations. People who disappear. What kind of other things? Lena pressed, leaning closer, her heart beginning to pound with a mix of dread and determination. Quinn's eyes darted to the window, scanning the empty street outside as if he expected someone to appear at any moment, as if the very air might carry his words to hostile ears. Don't know exactly. But men who ask too many questions about it don't come back. Your brother, he asked questions. He was trying to fix something, I think. Trying to make it right. Then he stopped coming to town about 3 months ago. And nobody's seen him since. Lena felt her stomach tighten into a hard knot. The timeline matched 3 months since the letter stopped. Do you think he's alive? Quinn hesitated, then nodded slowly, reluctantly. Maybe. If they still need him. He was good with the wires, real good. Best telegraph man I ever saw. But you should leave this alone, miss. For your own sake. The syndicate don't take kindly to people poking around their business. But leaving it alone was not an option. Not for Lena. Henry was all she had left in the world, and she would not abandon him to whatever fate had swallowed him without at least trying to pull him back. That afternoon, she asked more questions at the general store, at the blacksmith's, at the saloon, where men gathered to drink rot-gut whiskey and complain about the heat and the prices and the way the territory seemed to be changing for the worse. Most people looked away when she mentioned Henry's name, their faces closing like shutters, unwilling to meet her eyes. One old miner, his face seamed with age and sun damage, stepped outside and spat tobacco juice into the dirt before speaking. Mercury Falls is poison, he said bluntly, his voice rough as gravel and just as sharp. They use mercury to process the silver, and it gets in the water. Runoff flows into White River, and from there it spreads. Fish floating belly up downstream. Ranch children getting sick, rashes, trembling hands, coughing fits that go on for days and never quite stop. But nobody does nothing about it. because Bison Bill owns the sheriff and half the town council, and Braxton makes sure no one looks too close at anything the syndicate does. What about my brother? Lena asked desperately, her voice cracking despite her effort to stay calm. The miner shook his head, his expression a mix of pity and wariness. Don't know your brother, miss. But I know enough to say you should leave this alone if you value your life. The syndicate has long arms and longer memories. But the warning only hardened Lena's resolve. Whatever Henry had stumbled into, he was in danger, and she would not turn away. It was late afternoon when Lena made her way to the livery stable at the far end of town, thinking she might need to rent a horse if she was going to search the spur line herself. The stable was a long, low building that smelled of hay and manure and horse sweat, the air thick and warm. Dust motes floating in shafts of golden light that slanted through cracks in the walls. She was checking the price list nailed to the wall, prices she could not afford. Not by half when she heard voices nearby, and turned to see a man speaking in low tones with the stable hand. He wore buckskin and moccasins, and his posture was relaxed but watchful, the way a man stands when he has learned through hard experience that trouble can come from any direction at any moment. His face was angular, all sharp lines and planes, and his eyes were dark and unreadable, reflecting nothing but the world around them. He was trading a bundle of pemmican and several rawhide straps for coin, his voice calm and even his gestures economical and precise. Lena did not mean to eavesdrop, but the stable was small, and voices carried easily in the confined space. She heard him mention the Mercury Falls spur, heard him say something about land that used to belong to his mother's people, about a spring camp where families had gathered every year for generations until the railroad came through and fenced it off, claiming the land through some legal maneuver no one fully understood and fewer still could challenge. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge, a bitterness that spoke of old wounds that had never properly healed, of losses that could not be measured in money or land deeds, of injustices that compounded year after year until they became a weight too heavy to set down. When he finished his business and turned to leave, counting the coins in his palm, Lena stepped forward before she could think better of it, before caution could overrule desperation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice coming out louder than she intended, startling herself as much as him. "I heard you mention the spur line. I need to find my brother. He worked there, Henry Capel." The man Chaska, though she did not yet know his name, stopped and looked at her, his expression unreadable as stone. For a long moment she thought he would simply walk away without answering, dismissing her as he might dismiss an annoyance or a beggar. Then he said, his voice low and careful. What was his work? He fixed telegraph wires, maintained the lines. He was good at it, the best according to Quinn at the telegraph shack. Chaska nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected, some piece falling into place in a puzzle he had been working on for a long time. "I have heard that name. There is talk among the workers, the ones who slip into town when they can, who drink too much and say things they should not." He asked questions that made the syndicate nervous. Questions about where the night freight goes, about what gets hauled besides ore. "Then you know where he is." Hope flared in her chest, sudden and bright, almost painful in its intensity. "No. But I know the spur runs through land my people used for a spring camp before the railroad took it. The survey was wrong deliberately, I think, and the land was taken through legal papers that no one could read or challenge. The water there is poisoned now. My sister's child drank from it last winter." His voice remained steady, but something flickered in his eyes, grief raw and deep. She was 5 years old. Her name was Little Sparrow, and she liked to sing while she worked. She died 3 days after drinking that water, coughing blood, her body shaking so hard we could not hold her still. By the end, she did not recognize any of us. The words hit Lena like a physical blow, and she felt the air go out of her lungs. The casual cruelty of it, a child poisoned by greed and indifference, made her stomach turn. "I am so sorry." She whispered the words, feeling inadequate, even as she spoke them hollow and useless against the weight of such loss. Chaska's jaw tightened a muscle, jumping beneath the skin, and for a moment she thought he might turn away, might walk out of the stable and leave her standing there. Then he said, his voice rough, "Sorry does not bring her back. Sorry does not clean the water or punish the men responsible. But if your brother worked on that spur, he might know who is poisoning it and why. I will help you find him not for coin, but because I want to know where the poison comes from. I want to see the men responsible answer for what they have done. I want them to stand before a judge and hear their crimes named aloud. That is the only justice little Sparrow will ever get." That night, as Lena walked back to the boarding house through streets gone quiet and dark, the saloon still glowing with lamplight, but the rest of the town shuttered and silent, a ranch hand stumbled out of the saloon directly into her path. He smelled of whiskey and sweat and something else, something sour and unwashed, and his eyes were glassy and unfocused pupils wide in the dim light. Before she could step aside, he grabbed her arm with a grip hard enough to leave bruises, his fingers digging into her flesh through the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Where are you going all alone, pretty lady?" He slurred, pulling her toward the narrow alley behind the livery, his breath hot and foul on her face. Lena tried to twist free panic rising in her throat like bile, but he was stronger than she was, and her feet stumbled on the uneven ground. Fear spiked through her chest, sharp and cold, as a blade, not just fear of harm, but fear of helplessness, of being at the mercy of someone who saw her as nothing more than an opportunity. Then a shadow moved between them, with the speed of something born to hunt, and suddenly Chaska was there, his voice calm and direct. "Let go." The ranch hand blinked, swaying on his feet, trying to focus. "This ain't your business, Injun." "Let go." Chaska repeated, his tone unchanged, carrying no anger or threat, just absolute certainty. The man swung clumsily, a wide telegraphed punch that might have connected if Chaska had been slower or less aware. But Chaska ducked easily, stepped inside the blow, and slammed his shoulder into the man's chest. The ranch hand hit the ground, hard, landing flat on his back, with a whoosh of expelled air, his head bouncing once against the packed dirt. He lay there gasping, staring up at the stars, and did not get up. Chaska looked down at him for a moment, assessing whether he was truly down or just pretending, then turned to Lena. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her arm throbbed where the man had grabbed her, and her heart still raced. "Thank you." Chaska did not reply. He simply nodded once and started to walk away, as if rescuing women from drunks was something he did every night and required no acknowledgement. Lena followed him, her mind racing. This man had helped her without hesitation, without asking for payment or favor. And he had his own reasons to want answers about the spur-line reasons born of grief and rage and the kind of injustice that festered if left unanswered. "Wait," she called. "Your sleeve, it is torn." He glanced down at the rip in his buckskin, a long tear where the drunk's belt buckle had caught and pulled. "It will mend. I am a seamstress. Let me fix it. Please, it is the least I can do." He hesitated, and she could see him weighing the offer, calculating whether accepting help would create an obligation or simply acknowledge a practical exchange. Then he nodded. Back at the boarding house, Kate let them sit at the kitchen table without asking questions, though. Her eyes were sharp and curious, taking in the torn sleeve, Lena's flushed face, the way they sat carefully, not quite looking at each other. Lena threaded a needle by lamplight and worked quickly, her hands steady despite the tremor she still felt inside her stitches, small, and even the kind of work she had done 1,000 times before. When she finished, she tied off the thread and cut it with her teeth. "There," she said, smoothing the seam with her thumb. "Good as new." "Thank you," he said quietly, examining the repair with what might have been approval. She prepared provisions for the trail: hardtack biscuits, salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried beans, a small tin of coffee, and set them on the table. He took the belt knife from his hip and held it out to her. The blade clean and well-maintained, the handle wrapped in leather, worn smooth by use. "You should carry this." "I do not know how to use a knife." "Then I will show you." He positioned her hand on the hilt, his fingers wrapping over hers, his thumb pressing against the base of her thumb to keep the blade steady and the angle correct. His touch was firm but not rough, instructional without being condescending. He showed her how to hold it for defense, how to keep the blade between her and a threat, how to strike if she had no other choice. Later, when the fire burned low and the night turned cold, he passed her the edge of his blanket without a word, a simple gesture that carried more weight than elaborate courtesy. She took it, and he shifted so his back was between her and the draft. From the door, his body a windbreak against the chill. Small acts, no declarations, just survival becoming something that might in time become partnership. The next morning, they set out following the spur line south from town, moving through terrain that shifted from prairie to scrubland. Chaska walked ahead, reading the ground, with the concentration of someone translating a language written in dirt and stone. He pointed out drag marks and 2 sets of boot prints, one limping, one heavy with heel irons. "Someone was hurt here," he said, crouching to examine the depth of the prints, the way one foot had dragged slightly, leaving a scuff mark. Dragged or helped. Within 3 days. The dog picked up a scent and led them east into tall grass, its nose low to the ground, tail stiff with concentration. They smelled lamp oil and opium smoke, faint but unmistakable, the sickly sweet odor clinging to the air, like a stain. Chaska crouched and touched the ground where the grass had been flattened in a rough circle, then lifted his fingers to his nose. "Recent camp, 2 days, maybe less. 2 men from the prints. They sat here for hours, waiting for something or watching something. They crested a rise, and the wreck came into view, iron and wood, half hidden by brush, deliberately camouflaged rather than simply abandoned. Someone had draped canvas over the most obvious metal, had planted sage around the locomotive to break up its outline." Chaska circled slowly, finding fresh boot prints and tar still tacky on a patched tie. "This line is not abandoned," he said, his voice carrying conviction born of evidence. "It is hidden, still in use." They pried open the coach door with effort, the metal resisting until it finally gave way, with a shriek. Inside, shackles, gag cloths, mail sacks torn open, and the pigskin ledger filled with cryptic entries. Many were coded with symbols Lena could not decipher, geometric shapes, numbers that did not correspond to any obvious pattern, abbreviations that meant nothing to her. "What does this mean?" she asked, pointing to a column of strange marks that looked almost like musical notation. "I do not know," Chaska admitted, frowning at the page. "It is some kind of code, deliberate. Someone wanted to document this, but keep it hidden from casual inspection." Then he found the hidden cell beneath the bench and the crib bars, the fresh booty. The shock of it froze them both. A child had been here. Recently. Perhaps within the hour. That was when the shooting started, and they barely escaped with their lives and the ledger. They returned to Coyote Springs that evening, dusty and bruised, every muscle aching. Sheriff Praxton sat on his office porch, a slab-faced man with cold eyes and a revolver worn low on his hip. "Heard you two been poking around the old wreck," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "It is not old," Chaska replied evenly. The tracks are still in use. Praxton shrugged the gesture dismissive. Flood took that train last spring. Nothing out there but rust and memories? Then explain the fresh tar on the ties. Explain the boot prints that are less than a week old. Praxton's eyes narrowed, and something dangerous flickered in them. Calculation, maybe fear, certainly hostility. You calling me a liar, boy? Lena stepped forward before Chaska could respond, holding out the ledger. This shows deliveries people being moved like cargo. My brother's initials are in it. HK, Henry Capel, multiple entries. Praxton's gaze dropped to the ledger, and she saw recognition flash across his face. Not surprise, but recognition. He knew what the ledger was. He had probably seen it before. Hand it over. Chaska folded it back against his chest. Not to you. Silence hung thick, the tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Praxton's hand moved slowly toward his revolver, and Chaska's hand moved just as slowly to his knife. For a long moment, Lena thought they would draw and the street would erupt in violence. Then Praxton gestured to his deputies, two hard-faced men who stepped forward with rifles. Arrest him. Disorderly conduct. Threatening a peace officer. The deputies disarmed Chaska, roughly taking his knife and the small pouch he carried, and locked him in the cell at the back of the sheriff's office. Praxton turned to Lena with a look that made her blood run cold, a look that was part threat and part promise. You best keep quiet, girl, unless you want to join him. Or maybe I should let Tom know you are asking questions. He has been real interested in finding you again. Lena's stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. Tom. The name hit her like a fist to the gut, bringing with it a flood of memories she had tried to bury. She left quickly, her mind racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. She found Dr. Catherine Bell at her clinic, a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Doctor. Bell listened without interrupting as Lena poured out the story, the words tumbling over each other in her haste. I have seen the sickness, Dr. Bell said, after hearing Lena's story, her voice matter-of-fact, but carrying a layer of anger underneath the kind of anger that comes from witnessing preventable suffering. Children with rashes that do not heal. Ranch hands with tremors so bad they cannot hold a cup steady. Coughing that turns bloody. The water is poisoned mercury, I am certain. I have read enough medical literature to recognize the symptoms. But without proof, Praxton will not act. He is paid not to see what is right in front of him. We have proof, Lena said, holding up the ledger. But much of it is in code, and Chaska is locked up. Dr. Bell pulled a small telegraph key from her bag, the brass worn but functional. Quinn has a hidden line, a backup he rigged when he suspected the main line was being monitored. Get this to him. Tell him to send what he can read to the territorial marshal in Denver. The coded parts, we will need someone who understands them, someone who knows the railroad systems well enough to break the cipher. That night, Lena and Kate created a distraction. Kate went to the saloon and started a loud argument about watered-down whiskey, her voice carrying through the walls, drawing Tom and his men to the front of the building to watch the spectacle. While they were distracted, Lena slipped into the sheriff's office through the back door, which Kate had deliberately left unlocked earlier when she delivered laundry. Lena picked the cell lock with a hairpin, her hands shaking, but her focus absolute, the tumblers clicking one by one until the lock gave way. Chaska slipped out silently, and they escaped across rooftops as rifle shots splintered shingles around them, the crack of gunfire echoing through the night. When they jumped from the last roof to the alley below, Lena's ankle twisted on landing pane, shooting up her leg. Chaska lifted her briefly, his arms strong, and sure, then wrapped the ankle with a strip torn from his shirt, his fingers firm, but gentle, his breath close enough that she could feel its warmth. Can you walk? Yes. she said, though it hurt with every step. They disappeared into the darkness, moving through back alleys and dry washes until the town was far behind them. They spent the night in a gully, taking turns on watch, neither sleeping deeply. At dawn, they split up. Lena would take the ledger to Quinn and get what they could transcribed onto the wire. Chaska would search for Henry, following the rumors Sergei had mentioned about a trestle camp. Lena rode along the riverbank on a borrowed horse, the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tied to her saddle. 2 syndicate men spotted her and gave chase, their horses faster, their shouts carrying across the water. She urged her mount faster, but they were gaining. When they closed to rifle range, she did something desperate. She slashed one man's hand with her knife as he reached for her bridle. The blade cutting deep and then kicked him hard in the chest, sending him tumbling from his saddle into the shallows. The other fired the shot, spooking her horse into the willows. Bullets tore through leaves, whining past her head like angry hornets. She slid from the saddle and lay in the mud, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst, pressing herself flat as the hoofbeats thundered past and then gradually faded. She waited until the silence was complete, then rose shakily and checked the ledger, still secure, still dry. But she was alone on foot and miles from town. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, cold rain falling in sheets, turning the ground to slick mud, making every step treacherous. Lena stumbled through the darkness, her ankle throbbing, her clothes soaked through, shivering with cold and exhaustion. She had lost the trail, lost her bearings in the rain and the darkness. Thunder rolled overhead, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark flashes that disoriented more than they helped. Then she heard it, a low rumbling growl that made her blood freeze. She turned slowly and saw them, 3 wolves, their eyes reflecting the lightning, their bodies lean and hungry, moving toward her, with the patient certainty of predators who knew their prey was weakened. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down. Chaska had taught her, don't run. Make yourself large. Show no fear. She picked up a dead branch, thick and heavy, and held it like a club. She shouted the sound raw and harsh and swung the branch at the nearest wolf. It backed up a step, wary but not retreating. They began to circle, and she turned with them, keeping them in front of her, never letting them get behind. Her arms shook with exhaustion, but she kept the branch raised. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then one wolf lunged, not at her, but testing, probing for weakness. She swung hard, catching it across the muzzle. It yelped and fell back. The others retreated a few paces, reconsidering. She kept shouting, kept moving, kept the branch high. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, they melted back into the darkness, deciding she was more trouble than she was worth. Lena collapsed against a tree, shaking uncontrollably, tears mixing with rain on her face. But she was alive, and she still had the ledger. By the time dawn broke, gray and cold, she had found her way back to a path she recognized, and eventually, limping and exhausted, she made it to Quinn's shack. Meanwhile, Chaska tracked Prince to a Mercury sluice camp, miles from town, following a trail that led through increasingly poisoned land. A skeletal miner named Sergei crouched by a struggling fire, coughing blood into a rag, his hands trembling with mercury poisoning. "I need information," Chaska said gently, offering him water from his canteen. "The spur line. Where does it go?" Sergei glanced around nervously, his eyes darting to the shadows, as if expecting eavesdroppers. "Canyon tunnel. They roll cars through at dusk. Your woman's brother, they keep him at the trestle. He taps the telegraph line for them, intercepts messages, reroutes shipments. They broke his hip so he could not run. He is a prisoner, but a useful one." Chaska's jaw tightened, anger and pity warring inside him. "Where do they dump the tailings?" "White River, behind the school." Sergei coughed again, deeper this time, his whole body convulsing. We tried to complain, but Praxton ran us off. Said we were trespassing, said the land was private property. He fired over our heads to make his point. Chaska gave him more water and a strip of dried meat. Get out of here if you can. This place will kill you. Already has, Sergei said with bitter resignation. Just waiting for my body to catch up to the knowing. Then Crooked Teeth Tom stepped from behind rusted barrels, a chain hook in hand, his grin showing the broken, blackened teeth that gave him his name. You should have stayed out of this engine. Now you are going to learn what happens to people who stick their noses where they do not belong. They fought brutally among the sluice timbers in mud and poisoned water. Tom was bigger, stronger, vicious in a way that spoke of cruelty enjoyed rather than simply employed. He swung the hook in wide, vicious arcs, the rusted metal whistling through the air. He caught Chaska's shoulder, the hook tearing through buckskin and flesh, ripping a gash that bled immediately and profusely. Blood poured down Chaska's arm, hot and slick, making his grip uncertain. Pain exploded through his nervous system, white-hot and disorienting. He gritted his teeth and head-butted Tom, both men tumbling into the gray sluice water. The poisoned water burned everywhere it touched, filled Chaska's mouth with bitter metal, stung his eyes, and the open wound on his shoulder. He could feel it soaking into him, the mercury seeping into his blood, and knew he had minutes at most before the poison made him too weak to fight. He dragged himself free, bleeding, and dizzy, his vision swimming. Tom limped away, cursing, clutching his ribs, where Chaska had landed several solid blows, but still dangerous, still mobile. Chaska forced himself to his feet and stumbled away from the camp, each step agony, his shoulder on fire, his lungs burning from the poisoned water he had swallowed. He made it half a mile before collapsing in a dry wash, consciousness fading in and out. Hours later, he had no idea how many he woke to find Sergei kneeling beside him, wrapping his shoulder with relatively clean cloth. Thought you were dead, Sergei said. You are tough, tougher than most. But you need real help or that wound will fester. Cannot go back to town, Chaska rasped. Then go to the river camp. Dr. Bell sometimes comes there. She is the only one who cares about people like us. That evening, Lena and Chaska reunited at a hidden camp near the river, both of them battered and exhausted. Lena cleaned his wound by firelight, her touch gentle but thorough, washing away the blood and the poisoned water, her face tight with worry. The gash was deep, angry, and she could see red streaks beginning to spread from the edges, infection setting in. This needs real care, she said quietly, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay calm. If infection spreads, you could lose the arm, or worse. It will hold, he said, though his voice was weaker than usual. She met his eyes. You could have died today. That water, you swallowed it, did you not? I can see it in your face. So could you, he replied, nodding toward her torn dress, the mud and blood caked on her hands, the bruises on her arms. The wolves. You knew. I saw the tracks. 3 of them. You fought them off alone. Silence settled between them, heavy with things unsaid, admiration, fear, the growing realization that they were both risking everything for this, and that somehow, in the midst of danger and exhaustion, they had come to rely on each other in ways that went beyond simple partnership. Then Chaska reached for his carbine and showed her how to aim properly, positioning her stance. His hands guiding hers, despite the pain in his shoulder. Their faces were inches apart. She held his gaze longer than necessary, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the determination that kept him moving despite injury. He looked away first, but not before she saw something flicker there. Something that might have been tenderness. Later, as the fire died and the night turned cold, Lena's voice came soft from the darkness, barely audible over the crackle of embers. Chaska, I need to tell you something. He waited, his breathing slow, and even though she suspected he was not as close to sleep as he appeared. Tom found me 3 days before I met you. Her voice cracked and she paused, gathering herself. He said he knew where Henry was, said Henry was in trouble but could be saved if I cooperated. He made me promise to lead travelers to the wreck. He said it was a test, that if I proved myself trustworthy, he would take me to Henry. I did not understand what I was agreeing to. I thought maybe robbery, which seemed better than losing Henry. But he lied. He told me Henry was being held at a completely different location, miles from the wreck. He sent me there, first wasted 2 days of my time, searching empty buildings, while he watched and laughed. It was all a lie to control me, to see if I would obey. When I finally went to the real wreck and found you there, I realized I had been played. I brought you into danger because I was a fool who trusted a monster. Chaska was quiet for so long, she thought he might have fallen asleep, or worse, that he was too angry to respond. Then he said, his voice rough but steady, "You chose right when it mattered. That is what counts. You are not angry. I am angry at them, not you. You were trying to save your brother. There is no shame in that. Desperation makes us vulnerable to men like Tom. That is their weapon, and they wield it well. But you saw through the lies eventually, and you chose to fight. That is what matters." She felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of guilt she had been carrying since the shooting at the wreck. "I am done being used. Whatever comes next, I face it willingly." His jaw tightened, and she could see his profile in the dying firelight, strong, determined, battered, but unbroken. "Then we finish this. Together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than grammar alone could explain. Not just an alliance, but something deeper, a promise. The next evening, they returned to the wreck to transcribe the ledger before turning it over to Quinn. They needed a full copy in case the original was lost or seized. Quinn had given Lena charcoal paper for rubbings. They worked by candlelight, copying what entries they could understand, names, dates, amounts of money, locations. But the coded sections remained impenetrable strings of symbols and numbers that made no sense no matter how they arranged them. Without the key to this code, half the ledger is useless. Lena said in frustration, her fingers smudged with charcoal, her eyes burning from squinting at tiny handwriting in dim light. "We have proof of something, but not enough to show the full scope. A good lawyer could argue these coded entries mean anything or nothing." While she worked, Chaska moved into the cargo car, checking for anything they might have missed. The floor suddenly gave way beneath him with a crack of rotted wood. He dropped knee-deep, catching himself painfully on the joists, and looked down into the space below. A girl stared up at him, 12 years old, impossibly thin, with huge dark eyes that held far too much knowledge of cruelty. She was trapped in a cell built from crib bars, and the space so small she could barely sit upright. Chaska pulled her out carefully, his injured shoulder screaming in protest, and carried her to where Lena waited. Lena wrapped her in the shawl, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face, at the sight of the girl's condition, bruises, malnutrition, and the vacant look of someone who has been broken by captivity. The girl whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Isolde. They took me from the orphan train 3 weeks ago, said there was a family waiting, but it was a lie. A man named Henry tried to help me escape 4 days ago. He gave me food, told me stories, promised he would get me out. But they caught us before we reached the river. They took him to the canyon trestle to punish him, to make him understand what happens to people who help prisoners. They said if he ever tried again, they would kill a child in front of him. He told me if anything happened, I should tell whoever found me to look for the map he drew. He said he hid it under a floorboard in the switchman's hut near the trestle. He said the map has more than roots, it has the key to understanding the coded ledger entries. Without it, the ledger is just half a story." Lena's breath caught, and she gripped the girl's hands. "Henry Capel, That is my brother. Tall, thin, with brown hair and a scar on his left hand from a wire cut. Isolde nodded, tears streaming down her face. He talked about you. He said his sister was the smartest person he knew, that you would find him, if anyone could. Chaska's eyes widened as the implications sank in. That was the twist. The ledger alone was not enough. Henry had deliberately made himself bait, had let himself be captured while helping Isolde, knowing someone would come looking and find the evidence he had carefully constructed over months of forced labor. The map was not just a map, it was the cipher key that would unlock the full conspiracy documented in the ledger. Without it, they had proof of crimes, but not proof of the larger system. With it, they could bring down the entire syndicate. "We have to find him," Lena said urgently, her voice fierce with determination and fear. "And that hut. Tonight." Isolde pulled out the small knitted booty from her pocket, clutching it like a talisman. "This belonged to my baby sister. They took her on a different train 2 weeks before they took me. I kept it to remember her, to know I was not alone. Her name was Rose. She was only 2 years old." Lena's heart shattered at the thought, a baby taken and sold like livestock. But before they could move, lanterns flared outside, cutting through the darkness. Voices: Bison Bill Hart leading a search party, at least a dozen men. "They are here. Find them. I want that ledger, and I want them dead." Chaska lifted Isolde and squeezed through a broken window at the far end of the car. A lariat caught Lena's shoulder, jerking her backward. Chaska sliced the rope with one swift motion, the blade cutting clean through. A bullet grazed his ribs, burning a line across his side. They tumbled into the sage as the dog barked ferociously, distracting the riders, snapping at hooves and legs. They slid down a gravel cut into a dry arroyo rocks, tearing at their clothes and skin. Pressed together in the darkness, barely breathing. Chaska gripped Lena's wrist to steady her breathing, his fingers on her pulse point, counting the beats until they slowed. "Don't leave me." She whispered the words, escaping before she could stop them. "I won't," he answered, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything. His voice carried absolute conviction, and in that moment, pressed together in the dark, with danger all around them, something shifted between them, something that felt like the last walls coming down. They reached White River at dawn, exhausted, and carrying Isolde, who had fallen into a fitful sleep. The schoolhouse stood near the poisoned water, now a relief post where Dr. Bell treated sick children. The river showed an oily sheen, and dead fish floated along the banks, their bellies white and bloated. Dr. Bell examined Isolde immediately, her face grim but focused. "She will survive. She is stronger than she looks. But she needs rest, food, and safety, things that are in short supply right now." Before they could rest, Sheriff Praxton arrived with a posse, all armed, their faces hard and hostile. "I got a warrant to search for escaped prisoners," Praxton announced, waving a piece of paper that was probably blank or forged. "You have no warrant," Dr. Bell said flatly, blocking the door, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has spent decades refusing to be intimidated. "And you will not enter while I have patience. These are sick children, and I will not have you frightening them." Praxton pulled his revolver and fired into the air, the shot deafening in the morning stillness. Children inside screamed. Chaska positioned himself between the door and the children, his body a shield, his knife in his hand. "You will not fire again," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying despite its low volume. "Not here. Not at children." Dr. Bell stepped forward, her voice cutting like a scalpel. "If you harm a single person here, Sheriff, I will testify against you at every hearing. And you know my testimony carries weight. I have treated half the territory's children, and their parents trust me more than they trust you. Fire that gun again, and you will lose whatever legitimacy you have left." Prexton hesitated, his face flushing with anger and something that might have been fear. Then he lowered his weapon and rode away. But not before one of his men had stolen Lena's shawl bundle from where it lay on a bench of the original ledger, their only physical proof. Worse, Quick Quinn was found beaten near his telegraph key later that morning. The wire cut his face, bruised and bloody. Without the ledger and without the wire, they were isolated, cut off from help. And Henry was still missing. Without him and the cipher key he had hidden, the case would fall apart. The transcriptions they had made were incomplete, and without the key, they were meaningless. In a quiet moment, Chaska turned to Lena, his expression grave. "We need to find that switchman's hut. Tonight. The map and the cipher key are there, and they are the only things that will make sense of the ledger and prove the full conspiracy. Without them, we have nothing that will stand in court. A judge will dismiss everything as circumstantial." Lena nodded, her face set with determination despite her exhaustion. "Then we go to the canyon." Night fell, and with it came a storm clouds rolling in black and violent wind, howling through the canyon like something alive, and angry rain beginning to fall in heavy cold drops that stung like thrown gravel. Lightning split the sky in jagged lines, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark flashes that left after images burned into their vision. Chaska and Lena rode toward the canyon, where the trestle spanned a deep gorge, the river roaring far below, swollen with storm runoff and dangerous as a living thing. They left Isolde with Dr. Bell, the girl clinging to Lena's hand until the last moment, and moved with grim determination through the storm. As they approached the trestle through sheets of rain that made visibility nearly impossible, they saw far more activity than expected lanterns. At least a dozen men, and worse, Sheriff Prexton himself was there standing beside Bison Bill, actively directing the operation like a general commanding troops. "Blast it all," Chaska muttered, water streaming down his face. "Prexton is not just corrupt. He is part of this, a full partner." Prexton's presence changed everything. He was not just a paid accomplice looking the other way, he was a participant actively helping to load a powder wagon onto a flatbed rail car. The wagon was filled with barrels marked with red X's, explosives, meant to blow the town waterworks and destroy evidence to bury the poisoned water under rubble and make investigation impossible. "We are outnumbered," Lena said, fear tight in her voice. "Badly. Then we move smart, not loud." Chaska replied, his mind racing through possibilities. "First, we find the switchman's hut and get the map. Then we stop the wagon." They left their horses tied in cover and moved on foot through the storm, staying low, using the darkness and the rain as cover. The switchman's hut was a small structure built into the rock face near the tunnel entrance, barely visible in the rain, its outline blending with the cliff face. They forced the door, the wood swollen with moisture and reluctant to open. Inside, by the light of a single candle, Lena shielded with her body, they found Henry. He lay on a narrow cot, his face pale and drawn. His hip clearly dislocated. Lena could see the unnatural angle, one hand pressed to his ribs, where they were probably cracked or broken. When he saw Lena, his eyes widened and tears spilled down his face, cutting tracks through the grime. "Lena," he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. "You came. I knew you would. I knew if I could just hold on long enough, you would find me." She knelt beside him, gripping his hand, feeling how thin he had become, how much weight he had lost. "I am here. We are getting you out." "No time." Henry gasped, each breath clearly painful. "The map under the floorboard, northeast corner. It shows everything. All the routes, all the drop points, every station where they transfer prisoners. But more, it has the cipher key. The ledger uses a substitution code I created from an old railroad scheduling system. The symbols correspond to letters based on train car numbers and routing codes. Without the key, the coded entries are gibberish. With it, you can read everything: names, amounts, locations, dates. Every crime they committed documented in their own handwriting. Chaska pried up the loose floorboard with his knife and pulled out a flour sack that had been unfolded and covered with careful drawings and notations. The map was detailed, showing routes across 3 territories linking towns and mines and remote stations. In one corner, written small and precise, was the cipher key, a grid matching symbols to letters, a legend for translating the coded portions of the ledger. "This is it," Chaska said, his voice carrying weight and relief. "This is exactly what we need." Henry coughed, pain crossing his face, his body convulsing. "I let them catch me. After I helped Isolde, I knew I could not escape. My hip was already injured from a fall, and Tom made sure I could not run. So I made myself part of the evidence. I marked the ledger, drew the map, created a trail someone could follow. I gambled that someone would care enough to look, that you would come, Lena. I bet my life on it." "We care," Lena said, her voice breaking, tears mixing with rain on her face. "You did not gamble wrong. You were brave, Henry. Braver than anyone should have to be." "Get the map to the marshal," Henry said urgently. "Decode the ledger. Finish this. Make them pay for every child they took, every life they ruined." Chaska helped Henry to his feet as gently as possible, supporting most of his weight. "Can you walk?" "Not well, but I can try." They moved out of the hut into the storm and came face to face with crooked-teethed Tom and 3 armed men, all carrying rifles, all looking eager for violence. "Thought you might come here," Tom said, grinning through his broken teeth, water streaming off his hat brim. "Boss said to watch for you. Now I get to finish what I started at the sluice. Going to make it hurt, Injun. Going to make you beg." Chaska stepped in front of Lena and Henry, knife in hand, his wounded shoulder screaming, but his grip steady. "You will have to go through me." "That is the plan," Tom said and lunged. The fight was brutal and desperate, made worse by the rain and the darkness and the uneven footing. Tom was bigger, fueled by rage and sadistic pleasure, and he fought with the viciousness of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. His men moved to flank, trying to surround them. Chaska fought with everything he had, but he was already wounded from their previous fight, his shoulder barely functional, and Tom knew it. Tom slammed a fist into Chaska's injured shoulder, and Chaska's vision whited out with pain so intense he nearly lost consciousness. His knife fell from nerveless fingers, clattering on the wet rock. Tom grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against the rock wall, the impact driving the air from Chaska's lungs. "You are done, Injun. Should have stayed on your reservation. Should have minded your own business." Chaska could not breathe. His vision dimmed, black spots swimming at the edges. Tom's face filled his view, twisted with triumph and cruelty. Then a gunshot cracked through the storm, deafening and sharp. Tom jerked and released him, clutching his leg. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and thick. Lena stood with Chaska's carbine, her hands shaking, but her aim true enough. She had hit Tom in the thigh, not a killing shot, but enough to drop him, to take him out of the fight. "Get back," she said, her voice shaking but fierce, the gun still trained on Tom. "All of you. Get back or the next shot goes higher." Tom's men hesitated, uncertainty crossing their faces. The dog, which had followed them despite orders to stay behind, lunged and grabbed one man's wrist, shaking viciously, teeth sinking deep. The man screamed and dropped his rifle. In the chaos, Chaska retrieved his knife and slashed the rope, holding the lantern above them. It fell and smashed, plunging the area into darkness, except for lightning flashes that came and went, like strobe lights. They ran, Chaska half carrying Henry, whose face was gray with pain. Lena clutching the map, the dog leading them through the storm with the instinct of an animal that knows the land. Behind them, Tom's curses and Praxton's shouted orders echoed through the canyon. But they were already disappearing into the darkness. They reached the trestle and saw the powder wagon being moved into position. Saw Bison, Bill, and Praxton working together, clearly planning to ignite the fuse and send the wagon down the line toward town, toward the waterworks, toward the school and the clinic where innocent people slept. "We have to stop them," Lena said, her voice raw. "We will," Chaska replied grimly. He handed Henry to Lena, who propped him against a rock, then belly-crawled under the trestle through rain and wind that threatened to tear him loose, the structure groaning overhead, like something alive. Lena helped Henry to cover, then took the carbine and moved along the ties, staying low, her ankles screaming with every step, but her determination overriding the pain. Lightning provided brief, stark illumination that turned the world into a nightmare landscape of shadow and light. A guard spotted Lena and moved to intercept, his rifle raised. She stabbed with her knife, the blade catching his belt and cutting through. His gun fell clattering on the ties, and he stumbled backward, grabbing for the rail. His fingers slipped on wet wood, and he fell not into the river, but onto a ledge below, screaming as he landed hard. Chaska reached the wagon coupling and began working to disconnect it, his fingers numb from cold and wet, the metal slippery. Praxton saw him and drew his revolver, his face twisted with rage and fear. "Thought we had you?" Praxton shouted over the storm water streaming down his face. "You are persistent, I will give you that. But this ends now." He fired. The bullet struck the timber beside Chaska's head, sending splinters flying, one of them cutting his cheek. Chaska rolled, and the coupling came free with a metallic shriek. The wagon began to roll backward away from the rail car toward the edge of the trestle. Tom, wounded but not stopped, appeared through the rain like something out of a nightmare, dragging his injured leg, but still moving, still dangerous. He shoved a lit fuse toward the wagon, his face contorted with rage and pain. "If I am going down, I am taking all of you with me." The fuse caught fire, crawling along it despite the rain, protected by tar coating. Smoke billowed thick and black. Chaska tackled Tom, and they crashed together into the mud near the mine entrance, grappling desperately. Tom was crazed with pain and rage, fighting with the strength of a dying animal that knows it has nothing left to lose. He caught Chaska's throat again and squeezed his grip like iron, his broken teeth bared in a rictus grin. Chaska's vision tunneled, consciousness fading. He could not breathe. Tom's face, twisted and triumphant, filled his vision. "This is how it ends," he thought distantly. Then the dog clamped onto Tom's wounded leg, and Tom screamed, a sound of pure agony. His grip loosened just enough. Chaska drove his knee into Tom's gut with all the strength he had left, and Tom doubled over. Chaska rolled away, gasping, his lungs burning, his throat bruised. Lena grabbed a wet gunny sack and beat at the fuse, trying to extinguish it. Smoke choked her, tears streaming down her face from the acrid fumes. The wagon teetered on the edge of the trestle, the fuse nearly burned through seconds from detonation. Then Isolde, who had disobeyed orders and followed them, unable to stay behind when the people who had saved her were in danger, appeared and threw a bucket of river water on the fuse. It hissed and dyed smoke, curling up in a final defeated plume. The wagon settled, the danger past. Tom lay groaning in the mud, unable to rise his leg, a ruined mess. But Bison Bill, seeing everything collapsing around him, seeing his empire crumbling, grabbed the stolen ledger from his saddlebag and ran for his mule, kicking it toward the river ford. Chaska and Lena, exhausted and battered, climbed onto their horses and gave chase through the storm, determination overriding exhaustion. Lightning split a cottonwood tree with a deafening crack, the trunk exploding in a shower of splinters and fire. The horses screamed, but ran on their eyes, white with terror. At the ford, the river was a raging torrent, swollen with storm runoff, the current so strong it had uprooted trees and sent them tumbling downstream like toys. Bill's mule plunged in, and the current grabbed it immediately, pulling it sideways. Bill tried to control it, sawing at the reins, but the ledger slipped from his grip and tumbled into the water. Chaska urged his horse forward without hesitation, plunging into the flood. The water rose to his saddle, then higher, the current pushing with terrible force, trying to sweep him downstream. His horse fought to keep its footing muscles straining. He lassoed Bill's gun hand as Bill raised his revolver, the rope snapping tight and jerking Bill's arm. The gun discharged into the air, the shot lost in the roar of the storm. The mule bucked, throwing Bill into the water. Lena rode in her horse, struggling chest-deep in the current, its eyes rolling with fear. She linked arms with Chaska, and together they grabbed Bill and dragged him under briefly until his struggles weakened, then hauled him up coughing and beaten. Not dead, but neutralized, broken, finished. The ledger drifted downstream, tumbling in the current. Isolde waded in, chest-deep, the water pulling at her like grasping hands, and grabbed it just as a plank from the wagon came spinning down the current. The massive piece of wood slammed toward her. Chaska yanked her to shore at the last second, the plank missing her by inches, close enough that the wind of its passage blew her hair. They all collapsed in the mud, gasping, soaked, battered beyond measure, but alive. The storm raged around them, but they had won. They had stopped the wagon, captured Bill, and saved the ledger. They had the map, the cipher key, and Henry. They had everything they needed. Dawn broke gray and cold. Quick Quinn face, bruised, but determined, his hands shaking, but steady enough, hammered at his repaired telegraph wire. Dr. Bell and Sergei, working through the night with borrowed tools, had spliced it, restoring the connection. Now the key clicked steadily, sending transcribed ledger entries line by line to the territorial marshal in Denver and to the newspaper offices in 3 territories. With the cipher key from Henry's map, they decoded the symbols. The full scope of the conspiracy emerged: not just orphan trafficking and forced labor, but systematic land theft through forged surveys, bribery networks spanning 3 territories, and reaching into territorial government and environmental poisoning for profit. Names, dates, amounts. Everything documented in meticulous detail by men who never imagined their records would be read by hostile eyes. Praxton tried to seize the telegraph shack, riding up with his remaining deputies, but townsfolk blocked his way. Farmers, ranch hands, women who had lost children, men who had watched their land stolen. They formed a human wall, armed with pitchforks and rifles and simple determination. "No more," they said as one, their voices blending into a single declaration. Praxton looked at their faces and saw his power had evaporated like morning dew. The fear that had kept them silent was gone, replaced by anger and solidarity. He rode away in silence, knowing his time was finished. Darfoba. Bell testified to the mercury poisoning, providing medical records and case studies. Sergei confirmed the dumping, naming dates and locations, and describing the operation in detail. Isolde listed the children, taken their names and ages, and where they had been taken from. Henry, despite his injuries, gave a detailed account of how he had been forced to tap the telegraph line, and how he had deliberately created the coded ledger entries and hidden the cipher key as insurance, building a case against his captors, one careful notation at a time. The territorial marshal's men arrived by afternoon, a company of them armed and determined. They arrested Bison Bill Hart, Crooked Teeth, Tom, and Sheriff Praxton, shackling them with irons, ignoring their protests and threats. By court order, the illegal spur line was dynamited 3 days later. The explosion echoing through the canyon like thunder, the rails twisted into useless scrap, the hidden route destroyed forever. In the clinic, Lena washed Chaska's wounds and the deep gash on his shoulder, the graze on his ribs, bruises covering half his body, the burns from the poisoned water. He sat still as she worked, and when he winced, she steadied his face with her fingertips, her touch gentle and careful. "You kept your word," she said quietly. "You saved my life," he replied. "That shot you took at Tom, It gave us the chance we needed. Without it, I would be dead in that mud. We saved each other, she said, meeting his eyes. More than once. Their eyes met and held. Something passed between them that needed no words, recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. But both felt like a current running beneath everything else. Henry was moved to Dr. Bell's clinic, where she reset his dislocated hip, a painful process that left him weak but healing. Sergei died 2 weeks later, his lungs finally giving out the mercury poisoning too far advanced to reverse. His last words to Chaska were, "Make the water right." "I promise," Chaska said, gripping the dying man's hand, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. True to that promise, Dr. Bell organized a cistern project upriver using funds from the court settlement. Chaska donated the court-ordered right-of-way fee. The land stolen from his family was returned, along with compensation that finally acknowledged the theft, and worked alongside Henry and dozens of others to build clean water access. They dug channels, laid pipe-built storage tanks, working from dawn to dusk until the system was complete. The court investigation revealed the full extent of the syndicate's crimes. The forged survey that had stolen Chaska's family land was exposed and nullified. The spring parcel was returned to its rightful family line, along with the fee paid into a tribal fund. 17 children were recovered from various locations across 3 territories, including Isolde's baby sister Rose, found in a workhouse in Nevada. The reunion was tearful and joyous, the 2 sisters clinging to each other as if they would never let go. Isolde was fostered by kind Kate, who read to her every night and taught her letters and numbers. Isolde never stopped wearing the booty on a cord around her neck. A memorial to suffering survived, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could persist. Lena was offered work sewing for the railroad under new management, decent pay, and steady hours, but she declined. She stayed near the spring project, cooking for crews, mending clothes, teaching Isolde to stitch strong seams, and showing her how to turn scraps into something useful. Chaska was offered a deputy's badge by the new sheriff, recognition of his role in bringing down the syndicate, but he declined as well. The line between his people and town law was still fragile, still complicated by decades of broken treaties and betrayals, and he would not blur it. But he accepted a scouting position, mapping safe water routes and helping to plan irrigation systems that would benefit both the town and the tribal lands. One cold night in early autumn, when the cistern was nearly complete and first snows threatened on the northern horizon, a norther snapped through with vicious cold, dropping temperatures 20 degrees in an hour. Lena sat trying to thread a needle by lamplight, but her hands were too numb, her fingers refusing to cooperate. Chaska crossed to her and took her hands in his, cupping them, blowing warm breath across her cold fingers. His eyes stayed on the needle, giving her privacy, but his touch was gentle and careful. She felt the warmth spreading, feeling returning in tingles, and then in steady sensation. Slowly, the numbness faded. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder for a single second, small enough to dismiss, brief enough to pretend it was nothing but. He felt its weight, understood its meaning. No vows, no declarations. Just a partnership acknowledged through survival, through shared danger and shared purpose. Through the slow accumulation of moments that added up to something neither could ignore. Later, when he prepared to ride out to check the high meadows and make sure the water routes were ready for winter, Lena handed him a wrapped parcel, a newly sewn rifle sling, padded so it would not bite his wounded shoulder, stitched with care and precision. "Thank you," he said quietly, running his fingers over the stitching, seeing the hours of work it represented. "I will be back by first snow," he added, meeting her eyes. "You had better be." She replied, her faint smile carrying weight, carrying promise. In a land where law bent with money and power, evidence and witness and courage had bent it back. One ledger decoded, One child saved 17 children saved. One spring returned. One community standing together against those who would poison their land and steal their children. The river cleared slowly, the mercury dissipating over months. By spring thaw, fish returned, silver scales flashing in clean water that no longer tasted of metal and death. People drank without fear. Children played without rashes, without the tremors that had marked the poisoned generation. The rusted train stayed half swallowed by grass, a warning and memorial. Kate's sighthound trotted past it one afternoon, no longer nervous, no longer sensing danger. The past had been logged, accounted for, the guilty, punished, the survivors healing. Justice had been served, imperfect, incomplete, arriving too late for some, but real. Real enough to matter. Real enough to change things. And in the spaces between work and winter, and watching the prairie change with the seasons, two people, who had every reason to remain alone, found themselves building something together. Not storybook romance, not grand declarations, but partnership earned through fire and fear and the profound act of choosing trust when the world had given them every reason not to. The wind still combed the tall grass of Coyote Springs Prairie in long whispering strokes. But the voices it carried now were different. No longer just warnings and ghosts, but also hope. And the promise that even in the hardest land, justice could still take root, could still grow, could still matter. Quiet beat. That evening, when the last report was signed and the horses watered, the town fell into a workable hush. Lena set a tin cup of willow bark tea by Chaska's hand, without a word. He checked the lash knots on a wagon wheel, then looked up to where Isolde and the baby slept on a pallet near the stove. Outside, prairie wind combed the grass the way a mother idly smooths a child's hair. "We will make the water right," he said, not loud. Not for a crowd, just for the room, and for the ones who would wake tomorrow and find the world still here to repair.